lecture. Thank you for coming. This is the first in 7 of the Provost Lecture Series. We have 7 lectures that will be taking place, and Benjamin's is first. And his advisor will be introducing him, Ms. Ulster, and she will now discuss what he's going to be talking about. Thank you very much.
I've known Benjamin Schachtman now for 4 years, and it's been a tremendous pleasure to have worked with him during that time. In many ways, this should not have been surprising. The recipient of a Graduate Council Fellowship, Ben arrived at Stony Brook trailing quite an impressive set of credentials. His work on dark comedy had already been included by Maurice Charney as a chapter in a book on comedy, a geographic and historical guide, a paper, Reconstructions of Fascism, Strategies of Trauma Response, was presented at the College English Association conference while Ben was still an MA student at New York University. As the title of his talk today indicates, Ben's dissertation grows out of these early interests. And when I say grows, I mean grows exponentially. I'm not quite sure if that's the proper term mathematically, but I'm an English professor, so I don't have to be sure of that. A project that is as ambitious as it is provocative, Ben's dissertation examines the ways in which dark comedy has proven a particularly effective tool for negotiating the effects of traumatic experiences. Beginning with a discussion of works that deal with the horror of war, it moves to a discussion of the horror of transgression, notably bodily transgression. From that discussion of bodily dismemberment, it shifts to a consideration of national dismemberment. And finally, from that interrogation of the idea of nation, it ends with a reappraisal of ethnic identity, a discussion of the horrors of genocide that brings the discussion full circle. As might be imagined, such a project requires a tremendous degree of theoretical sophistication, notably in both postmodern theory and trauma theory. And this Ben possesses in abundance. What makes his work so completely unique, however, is the fact that Ben is not bound by the theories of others. And by that I mean just this. While he may integrate the work of others as needed, he does so in such a way that his own voice remains loud and clear. The result, as I think you'll find at the end of his talk today, is scholarship that is as intellectually stimulating precisely because it is so completely original. So it's my great pleasure to present to you Ben Schachtman.
Thank you very much, Stacy, and thank you guys for coming out. I know there's a lot of other things going on today, the convocation, some sort of free food in the main area, so thank you. What I want to do today is perhaps avoid some of the more specific and jargony parts of my dissertation that, for better or worse, I must engage in, and give you a little bit of a narrative of how I got to where I am, and then talk mostly about Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which has been done to death, but I have good reason for kicking that dead horse. So where I want to start is a little over 10 years ago at Rutgers University when I was an undergrad, as Stacy mentioned. And I worked for The Medium, which was the humor publication there. This is not the kind of thing you usually put on your CV. In fact, I've had people tell me that I should take it off. Thankfully, they've finally de-archived some of the photos from The Medium, so you can no longer find me in Catholic schoolgirl garb, which is good, because I'm going on the job market in the next year or so, and people will Google the bejesus out of you. But as the humor magazine, we had to come out with an issue after 9/11. We had to say something. We didn't have the same sort of weight on our shoulders as, say, Time magazine or The Onion on one side of satire or the other. But we had to do something. What kind of jokes could we make? And you have to imagine that we were stewed in that collegiate, self-obsessed, narrow vision of the world, and also that we were really harsh people. We were the college humor magazine, which meant that of all the mean-spirited people in college, we were the mean-spiritedest. And what I noticed at the time, though, was that there were we all wanted to say something horrible. So to get that out there. We all wanted to say something horrible, but there were two distinct camps. There was one camp of people who wanted to say something horrible, but who felt that it would have some benefit. That in saying something horrible, we could relieve some of the stress, some of the anxiety that was going on. And there was another group of people seemingly completely unfazed by what had happened, who just wanted to inflict their sense of humor on people. And the weird part for me was that we were telling essentially identical jokes. And this got me thinking about the topography, you might say, of a joke. In that you can't just look at the text, right? You're forced into a broader appreciation of who's telling the joke, who's receiving the joke. And so when I started writing my undergraduate thesis, these questions were in the back of my mind. And so what my undergraduate thesis did, in a very simplistic undergraduate kind of way, was to try to map out and define for myself what dark comedy was. And dark comedy was what I thought I was doing as an undergraduate humorist, right, a sophomorist. And so here's the basic gist of what I came up with, was that dark comedy wants it both ways. When you make a joke, and this was the classic joke, so I apologize in advance because this is offensive. The classic joke, and the joke I started my article with, was what's called the baby in a blender jokes. It's almost always set up as a call and response, question and answer. So it's question, what's red and silver and spins around? And the answer is a baby in a blender. So two different kinds of people, according to me, might tell this joke. One would be a sadist, a person who has no moral compunction, no babies themselves, I would guess, or a very colicky baby. And we all have moments. So they would tell it strictly to violate social taboos that we don't kill babies, right? To violate social taboos that we don't engage in that kind of violent humor, right? Sadism for its own sake and chuckles as a bonus. And then there was a kind of person who might tell the joke as a way of venting that constant undergraduate existential fear of death, which is more moderate in our normal lives because we have to work. We have to get to work. We have to manage interpersonal relationships. When you're in college and reading Schopenhauer all day long, you can dwell on death a bit too much, and these jokes allowed you a way to make fun of death, the inevitability of death, the absurdity of death and its meaningless, without totally collapsing into a German philosophical state of sadness. It did something for you. Okay? And so that was dark comedy. Right? Dark comedy was something that was simultaneously tragic and comic. And all of the usual means of comedy were available at your disposal if you wanted to tell a dark comic joke. But what was important was that it wasn't just juxtaposition. It wasn't a mixing of genres. It wasn't, for example, Life is Beautiful, right? Which is a very funny movie that all of a sudden stops being funny and becomes horrifying. Right? Very few people, except for sadists, if you've seen the movie, there's Benigni discovers a stockpile of dead bodies. Very few people chuckle at that scene, and that's probably encouraging for mankind. And dark comedy isn't that. Dark comedy is something that is simultaneously funny and tragic. And so that's essentially where I left my undergraduate work. Right? It was sort of a genre approach to things. And I found a number of works, and of course as an undergraduate I was drawn to the most abstruse and the most depressing of these works. But that's where I left it off. And it wasn't until I came to graduate school and went through the traditional angsty introductions with theory that I found a way to sort of push this a little bit further and think about it in a deeper and more sophisticated way. And I'm aware of the irony of referring to my own work as deep. It happens. But that is this. This is what I discovered, was that I was talking about works just as an audience. So you watch Sophocles, or you watch Catch-22, the film, or you hear a joke, and you're the audience. And so what is tragic about what happens, right, which lets you know you still have some moral sense, however constructed or artificial, right? You still find it terrible when people are mutilated, sad when nations are destroyed, so on and so forth. What's tragic for you as the audience is traumatic for the characters if we treat them as psychologically real. I don't know what's going on back there. I'm just going to, I think fun. If it starts making demands, we'll do something. And this is when I was introduced to the idea of trauma. So a brief overview of trauma, probably a 5-minute overview of trauma, might be helpful. So the essential theory of trauma is from a psychological point of view, it's an event that's too much. I think that's the simplest way to put it. It's too violent, it's too extreme, it's too loud and noisy, right? Trauma doesn't necessarily have to be sexual, although many of the early theories revolved around sexual trauma. And early models of trauma had this very simple amnesia model, where something overwhelming happens to you, and in your inability to process it, you stow it in the unconscious, right? That's the Freudian way of saying it. Or you repress it, or it's just not available to you the way traditional memories are. And it was an on and off system. So for example, the earliest cases where you've got sexual trauma, you have no idea that this happened to you. And in the Freudian cases, you see the classic symptomatic acting out. Physical symptoms that in some Freudian way, however much of a stretch, connect your modern day hysteria to your ancient childhood sexual trauma. This became almost overwhelmingly a female disorder, this idea of trauma and then amnesia, until we start seeing railway accidents, mining accidents, and then World War I, where we see a massive wave of traumatized male soldiers. What Freud's suggestion is that this is male hysteria, that these are men who had childhood sexual experiences that were overwhelming, that have been reactivated by the trauma of war, or the trauma of a railroad accident. And so in order to get them to get over their symptoms, whether it was hysterical blindness, or waking sleep, or whatever they were experiencing, you had to get them to remember the original trauma. So in the Freudian cases, you had this insistence that there must have been some childhood Oedipal disaster that we've now got to go back and revisit and force the victim to live through. Other less dogmatic, less Freudian people thought it was only important to remember the actual latest traumatic event, so that if you were in a train crash, it wasn't necessary that you remembered what happened when you were an infant. Right? So you can see where Freud would schism away from another group of psychologists, but the basic idea was that memory was an on-off switch. It was conscious or unconscious. So if something bad happened to you, you completely forgot it. You experienced symptoms because of the energy necessary to repress it. Once you remembered it, everything was okay, and you were good to go again. This is the magic of Victorian on-off hypnotic cures. If only it were that easy, I would get a pocket watch. I would quit today, I would open up shop, it would be great. But it's not. And as case studies evolved, and we stopped trying to build world models for patients, we got a little more sophisticated. And a number of questions came about because there were numerous people, numerous case studies, where in at least some sense people remembered what had happened to them. It's very difficult to forget a train crash. It's very difficult to forget being shot. I don't know if any of you have ever been shot or shot at. It's difficult to forget. But parts of the memory would sometimes be repressed, aspects of the memory. The next set of questions revolved around what kind of remembering would be sufficient. During World War I and then during World War II, there was a major schism between people who thought it was important to remember the exact, what we call the veridical details. The who, what, where, when, why, the objective truth of what happened. And there were some people who thought it was more important to re-experience the emotion of the moment. Both cases made their sides, and the split has actually never really been decided. In some sense, it's an artificial split created by two bodies of the psychological world. But again, the important part is that there were many different ways you could repress a memory, many different ways in which a memory could be overwhelming, and then many different ways you could then need to bring it to light. For most of the work I'm talking about in my dissertation project, the key question is it absolutely necessary that a traumatized person, or in the broader case, a traumatized nation, a traumatized ethnicity, remember the specific details? The classic case for this is the smokestack case. And these were escapees from a Nazi death camp who, in order to overcome their sense of trauma, had to recount the memory note for note. And there was a vast amount of disagreement about how many smokestacks the facility had. And so some people would say, this shows right here that once a memory is traumatized, your sort of objective sense of memory is traumatized. There's no getting it back, right? It's gone. It's always going to be reconstruction. This is where you see, in the 80s, the whole slew of false memories, a whole slew of charges of sexual molestation for people who then remembered these objective events later. And you can see how people who claim that the objectivity is not important could open themselves up to these kinds of criticisms. Right? You can imagine the socio-political ramifications. Right? If you're in South Africa, if you're in Nazi Germany, if you're the victim of domestic abuse. But it still becomes important for projects of literature and film, because ultimately, it seems to be, that this split still exists in texts, especially texts about traumatized people and cultural trauma, is that you see directors and authors leaning heavily towards the figurative or heavily towards the objective. We could do a whole spiel on this, but I will save you all. So that's one aspect that became increasingly important with thinking about trauma. Not just an on-off switch, but what kind of memory? The second question became about trauma as an external event or trauma as an internal event. And this is sort of equally important for my project. There's a whole school of theories that basically takes trauma as something that comes entirely from without, right? Even if it's just the quality of sensation or the quantity of sensation. Something is, imagine the most simplified version, extremely bright, right? Too much visual information overwhelms your system, right? In the case of, say, a Holocaust camp survivor or a rape victim, you would have someone who could not process that information, the sensory information, the way it felt, the way it smelled, the way it looked. And that's all banished from consciousness. So the damaging thing, the damaging force is this external perception. The other way of looking at it is that it's not so much the experience, but the repercussions of the experience. So imagine again, a death camp survivor, a rape victim. It was not the experience, it's not the sensation, as the psychological consequences. So this is to say, you have a certain theory of the world. That's how your psyche works. Right? You imagine there are certain bounds to human behavior. You're a Jew in Berlin in the late 30s, and you imagine it is not possible, right, for state-sponsored genocide. It's just not part of your cognitive map of the world. And then it is. And this destroys not just one local part of your cognitive map of the world, but your whole sense of how the world works. You have a sense, or to take a different example, you're the victim of much more personal attack, right? You have a sense of yourself as inviolable, right? As you have a sense of self-mastery. Attack on you takes that away from you, right? So it's not so much the experience, the pain, although that is certainly unfortunate, right? It's certainly damaging to the victim. But the real damage happens at the psychic level, where those things are broken down. So again, treating trauma as an external event or as an internal event. And again, you can imagine, for literary texts, for filmic texts, the difference in recreating that event. It is one thing to say, I will recreate Auschwitz. Right? I will recreate a sexual assault on screen, right? Whatever the politics of doing that might be. For this, aesthetically, in terms of representation, you could recreate what the trauma looked like. But if you're talking about a psychic event, what it looks like when a part of the mind changes, right? When someone's ego is destroyed, when someone's cognitive map of human behavior is radically shifted or destabilized, right? When someone's sense of themselves as an ethnic person, as a hetero or homosexual or bisexual person, and their sense of their gender is deeply destroyed, right? What does that look like? That's much more difficult to deal with in terms of representation. And again, you can see where some of this might buttress with the idea of an objective reality, right, that we have to recreate, or a more emotional, metaphorical, figurative reality. So again, two important questions to think about. The last question, which in each of my sort of dissertation areas I deal with towards the end, is the idea of translation, although not in, obviously, the traditional sense. By this I mean, many of the texts I've written on, or plan to write on, are about authors who have personally experienced trauma. Now, I've tried to avoid just doing straight psychobiology. It's often clear how their methods, their style has evolved from their own attempt to deal with the trauma. Okay? But then you have texts that deal with what we might call cultural traumas. Right? Our own Anne Kaplan has written on this extensively, and I have flat out pilfered some of her best work on it, which I will thank her endlessly for in acknowledgments. But the question is, can you, first of all, and then if so, how, right? How do you deal with something that is traumatic for a culture? I mean, the most obvious example, which has been already addressed over the last 10 years, was 9/11. Okay? And there are many theories about how cultures, for example, react. It's like one of these point wave debates in the sciences. So you've got one theory where there is no culture, right? There's just millions of individuals, and it says something about our alikeness, our similarities, that we all react similarly. So after 9/11, you see similar reactions in enough individuals that it adds up, and it looks like American culture is, say, repressing the political reality behind 9/11, right? America forgets our ties to Saudi Arabia. America forgets Afghanistan, right? America feels blindly and unexpectedly victimized, right? As if we had never interacted with any of these actors before. The other way of looking at it is in the much more metaphorical sense, right? Where we treat culture as if it is a giant psyche. And in either case, what we're doing, right, or what we're looking at when we look at these texts, is one or a small group of authors, if it's a film, right, trying to translate what that looks like for you as a viewer, you as a reader. Right? So the question is, how can you do that? What are the politics of doing it? What are the representational limits of doing it? Right? These are questions with any trauma. I think in the chapter on war, I deal with it most exclusively with Vietnam. Right? How do you translate the effect on American culture as a psyche of Vietnam? That sense of destabilization, that sense of radical uncertainty. Food for thought. All right. So those are my two interests, right? I came in to graduate school already thinking about dark comedy, and was able to supplement it by thinking about trauma. And the first work I wanted to deal with was Catch-22 because I had dealt with it extensively as an undergraduate, and I wanted to go back and evolve my thinking on it. So I don't know how familiar people are with Catch-22. Everyone is required to read it by the laws of the universe. It's not even that there's, you will read it, or you will date someone who insists that you read it, or it will just happen, or you'll absorb it by osmosis because everyone around you has read it. So I'll give you the briefest summary for my own purposes. And that there are 250 odd characters. For me, and the dissertation project, it's essentially the story of Yossarian. Captain John Yossarian, he's my captain at the end. I think his rank goes up and down. Allegedly you can map the actual chronological path of this book. I have my doubts. But in short, here's the story. It's a pilot who is in many ways similar to Joseph Heller and in some ways radically different than Joseph Heller, who on a mission on board a bomber is called to assist the door gunner, who has been badly wounded by flak, which is the perfect metaphor for the randomness and chaotic nature of sort of modern or even postmodern death, right? It seems to be death with no actor, it just happens, right? And throughout the course of the novel, we get this scene played over and over again, and every time it's played a little longer, so you learn a little bit more about the scene every time. The first time, it appears that Stone has a flesh wound, $1 million wound to the leg that will send him home, get him out of the war. This is good news. As far as being hit in the leg with flak can be good news, it's good news. In fact, Yossarian's gotten a very similar wound in his own leg earlier, chronologically in the novel. As we see more flashbacks, we see Yossarian capably treating Snowden. Bandages his leg, tells him it's going to be okay. Everything looks like it's going to be fine. As these flashbacks progress, we then see that there's a much larger wound to Snowden's side. And in the final flashback, Yossarian pulls away the flak jacket, and Snowden essentially decompresses, and his insides become outsides. And Yossarian, we see him biting his hand and going into sort of a stunned silence, and then sort of hypnotically repeating, there. There's no morphine because of a long, complicated side plot. But in essence, there's nothing he can do for Snowden. Snowden is dead already. And there's a passage that is maybe the most quoted of Catch-22 that essentially boils down to man is rot. This is the lesson he learns from Snowden, is that beyond simple mortality is a sense of meaninglessness and helplessness. It's not a happy part of the book. Right? And this is why some people complain that the end of the book is so ridiculously lighthearted and hopeful, because it's gotten about as grim as you can get. After the death of Snowden, the novel does a harrowing of Rome, where Yossarian wanders about the Eternal City, watching children being beaten, abuses of power, prostitution, every imaginable horror. The literal parallel is to Christ's harrowing of hell. And then when he comes out of it, he is almost reinvigorated, and he makes his decision to basically go AWOL, right? To flee the military, because he wants to escape Catch-22. And for those of you who don't remember the specifics of Catch-22, it is that if you ask to not fly any more missions, you are obviously sane, because if you fly missions, you will be killed eventually, like Snowden. But if you actually go to them, right, and say, hey, I don't want to fly any more missions, right, then you're crazy. It's not quite a double bind. If you really pry into Catch-22, it kind of falls apart. But the basic idea is that they can't tell you, right, you shouldn't fly any more missions. Although if you're flying missions willingly, you're obviously crazy. And it's hyper-cyclical. You can give yourself a serious, serious headache if you try to parse this out. But basically, if you ask to leave, you can't. And if you keep flying, you keep flying. There's no way out of it, except that you could run away, right? The only reason that Yossarian might not run away is that by running away, he sort of empowers Hitler, the evil powers of the world, right? And so Heller's book makes it explicit that the war is already won, right? The Germans have been crushed. It's just a matter of time. And so Yossarian's moral sort of problem is removed, and the only thing keeping him from action, the only thing keeping him from, it's not even a radical opting out, it's sort of a moderate opting out, to save his own bacon, so to speak, is that he's literally paralyzed, psychologically paralyzed by the events that he experienced with Stony. And he has to sort of work his way back through those events and witness both Snowden and then the world in all its late modern horror. Then, and only then, right, is he sort of free of that paralysis. So it looks a lot like, not the earliest Freudian methods, but early Freudian thinking, where you confront the traumatic event. It's awful, but you go through it, you analyze it, and afterwards you're free. And so at the end of the novel, Yossarian makes a break for it. Most people remember this as Snowden and his tall yellow raft, if you've seen the film. His plan is actually relatively sane. He's just going to get to the Italian mainland. And he actually has a fairly sentimental mission. He's going to rescue the kid sister of a prostitute that one of his friends was in love with. So it's a very sort of happy, moral, sentimental ending. And that's, I think, Heller's point. So this is the key to most of Heller's humor, is that it's realistic. It seems on the surface to be realistic jokes about an unrealistic world. Right? But Heller believes that underneath the apparent absurdity, however horrifying, of Catch-22, there's a real moral universe, right? A intelligible world, right? Heller's not a postmodernist. He does not believe in complete randomness, in complete chance, in indecipherability, right? He believes that human creations, like bureaucracies, have gotten in the way. But it's human action. It's not an ontological fact that the world is meaningless and chaotic. It's humans' fault, so humans can fix it. What this does is let us think about the overall structure of the book as a genre, as a dark comedy. Because even though there are individual portions, individual jokes in Catch-22 that treat the universe as random, that treat them as chaotic and meaningless, even the scene of Snowden's death, right? Underneath that, Heller believes there's a rescuable world, a salvageable world. Now that's dark comedy as a genre, okay? Moving through, there are moments that are very dark and moments that are very light. So I want to give you a brief idea of one of those moments. So this is, there's two. I'll give you one quick one. Early in the book, and this is one of the more criticized parts of the book, because if you consider you have to imagine the moral climate of the late 1950s. This was basically blasphemy, that you are making fun of an injured soldier. So if you still have those sentiments, I apologize in advance. So this is Heller writing about a character called the Soldier in White. The Soldier in White was encased from head to toe in plaster and gauze. He had 2 useless legs and 2 useless arms. He had been smuggled into the ward during the night, and the men had no idea he was among them until they awoke in the morning and saw the two strange limbs hoisted from the hips. The two strange arms anchored up perpendicularly, all four limbs pinioned strangely in the air by lead weights suspended darkly above him that never moved. Sewn into the bandages over the insides of both elbows were zippered lips through which he was fed clear liquid from a clear jar. A silent zinc pipe rose from the cement on his groin and was coupled to a slim rubber hose that carried waste from his kidneys and dripped it efficiently into clear stopper jars on the floor. And this is the part where people lost their minds. When the jar on the floor was full, the jar feeding his elbow was empty, and the two of them were simply switched quickly so the stuff could drip back into him. So, I don't know if any of you are pre-med. I am not. I actually asked a medical friend of mine what would happen if you did this. Turns out you would die. It also turns out that they did use glass jars. It is very steampunk looking. But they're radically different jars, just to be safe. Even though urine is usually yellow and saline is usually clear, just to be safe, radically different jars, different mounts, right? If any of you have any military experience, you know that there's a specific gadget for everything, and nothing is interchangeable, right? Like on the Toyota, because that would make sense. So it's not possible. And in many interviews, Heller repeatedly commented on how not possible this scene is. And yet it's presented as if it's absolutely real. And of course, it's an image less out of the military, right? Less out of the real world of field hospitals than out of cartoons, right? How many times have we seen Daffy Duck in head-to-toe body casts? How many times have we seen Wile E. Coyote get a safe drop on him, and then we cut to him in the full body cast, right? It's an unreal cartoonish image. And so here we have at the same time something horrible, right? If we were to take this as real, it would be horrible. Well, certainly people do get banged up quite badly in war, to put it moderately. Okay? So on the one hand, we have a novel that insists on its own reality. That this is a tragic. This might be the most horrible thing that could happen to you. In fact, it's taken directly from one of the most horrifying books I've ever read, which is Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun. And if you are Metallica fans, you've seen this in the video for one, and if not, good work for not being Metallica fans. Past their prime, to say the least. Trumbo's 31 book is about a soldier who's completely paralyzed, has no access to the outside world, and eventually figures out a way to Morse code, kill me, kill me, kill me, to his nurse. This is not a slap-happy book. Right? So that's the tragic element in the joke, and yet it's told in such a way that insists on its own comic possibilities. The imagery is comic, and just the sheer implausibility of it is comic. Not only that, the whole scene surrounding the introduction to the soldier in a way is a series of comic riffing. So what you in essence have is a series of jokes that get closer and closer to a tiny kernel of real tragedy, of real horror. And as soon as we get to this scene where we actually see something legitimately horrifying, even though it's sort of lightly protected for us in comic language, the novel then backs away. The sort of stream of dialogue that we're reading, the associative patterns of Heller's writing, move away from this, and we get a long and very strange comic riff, because shortly afterwards the soldier in white dies, and there's a very complicated argument about who has killed him and why. But the point is that the novel comes very close to this dark moment and then backs away. Heller's novel does this all the way through, and this, I think, is a key change in the way people think about Heller's work, is that ordinarily it's viewed as a work that gradually darkens. You've got really funny jokes up front, just pure, harmless is usually the word applied to it, harmless slapstick, although nothing is ever really harmless. And then at the end you've got pure horror, right? Rome under the Nazis or the Americans, either way, is pure horror. But that's not quite right. What the novel does is it keeps edging towards something dark and then pulling back. There's a great deal of complicated, jargony ways of me talking about this, which I'm sure would fascinate me. But because I only have about 5 minutes left, I'm going to spare you again. And say this instead. That the key point is that it's not that things can be funny or they can be horrifying. It's that they are both. And this has to do with who's telling the joke and who's hearing the joke. So, what's funny about this scene is what's funny about cartoons. When we see ridiculously violent things happen to cartoon characters, and this has only escalated since I was a kid. I can only imagine. I no longer have time for cartoons, I wish I did. When we see Daffy Duck get his face blown inside out by a shotgun, and then he still has time for snarky commentary, we laugh. Why do we laugh? Because it's radically incongruous with what we know would actually happen, or what we suspect would actually happen if you were shot in the face with a shotgun. You would not have time for a snappy one-liner, right? You would be dead, or in severe pain. In our laughter is a disavowal of that violence, right? But also kind of an acknowledgement. It's not purely fantastic, right? Daffy Duck is not purely immune to the violence. It's slightly skewed, right? So the scene with the soldier in white, it's funny in the sense that that couldn't really happen, right? And it allows us to, like Heller's prose itself, come close to that kernel of death, that sort of horrifying moment, and then back away. The laughter sort of protects us a little bit, just enough to deal with it. And so the theory, my argument, right, for Heller's overall work is that he paints a picture of Yossarian who is constantly taking part in these comic riffs, using humor as a way to wade in slowly, right, to the horror of Snowden's death, to the horror of the modern world. And for Heller himself, it's a way to tell his story in a way that at the same time is in some ways realistic. Because in some ways, Catch-22 is a very realistic book about World War II. There are catalogs of historical detail taken from Heller's own life, right? His own bomber squadron, his own bombing raids. And in fact, Nichols' film version reassembled, I think it's the world's 12th largest air force. Meticulous detail to recreate World War II, right? So in one sense, Heller is giving you that objective moment of trauma, right? What it's really like for him to have experienced that moment. And on the other hand, he's giving you something unreal, right? Something that conveys metaphorically, emotionally, figuratively, that we can have this conversation in many languages. The sense that is less connected to history, less connected to vertical reality, and more connected to, I think, what it looks like inside your own mind, what it looks like at the psychic level, when your sense of immortality, when your sense of mastery, when your cognitive map of the world collapses. So let me end on this because we're getting down the pike here. It is, on the one hand, possible to take Heller's own real-life experiences and sort of put Heller on the couch. It's a cheap out, but it lets us know a couple of things. In Heller's real-world experience, he experienced something like the first half of the Snowden flashback, where a gunner on his plane was badly wounded in the leg. Heller responded, bandaged him, gave him a shot of morphine, gunner lived, had kids, grandkids, right? A happy ending. Heller got a medal for this. I think it was a presidential medal, freedom, I'm not sure. Not freedom, bravery. But it all worked out well. In a neighboring plane, there was a gunner who was wounded exactly as Snowden was. Heller did not know him well, but he knew about it. And he was the one who was gutted by a piece of flak. He was the one for whom nothing could be done. And it was that experience that Heller writes about in his own autobiography, and again in several other fictional novels after Catch-22, that really got to him, that destroyed his youthful sense, because he was 18 at the time, destroyed his sense of imperviousness, destroyed any romantic illusions or fun about the war. And in fact, he didn't fly again for, I think it was like 20 years. He took a troop transport home, which is a rough way to travel. So on the one hand, his sense of trauma, right, doesn't look like the Snowden scene. Right? It happened internally, in his sense of what could and could not happen to him. Right? Completely invisible. But on the other hand, it is related to the real world. Right? There are sort of real world references, things that we can represent into the traditional, almost realist sense. And so what his sense of humor captures, at its best, if it works, is that recognition that somewhere in there it's important that there's the real world, right? It's not fully metaphorical. It's not, for example, a novel about whaling that is meant to be a metaphor for Heller's experience of war, right? The references are there for us to see what the real world objective trauma looks like. But on the other hand, the unreality of Catch-22, the sense of inescapableness, the sense of reason and moral decency collapsing completely, That's not something you can paint a picture of, but it's something you can evoke with a certain comic style. So that's, I think, what his work does. And there will be much more to say, so let me just leave you with this, is that this is not perhaps the way to go for everyone. There will certainly be people who say, for the needs of therapy, for the needs of socio-political aims, right? Dark comedy may not be the best way. There have been dark comic works done about apartheid, dark comic works done about the Holocaust. Only a few dark comic works done about 9/11 so far. And there are people who insist on a certain tone when you're testifying, when you're witnessing to something of that magnitude, something traumatizing. And there will also always be people who don't share Heller's moral sense, right? If we had another hour, we could go through the Vietnam films, and you could see the gradations of people who come closer and closer to, whether they're metaphorical or literal, a kind of sadism, right? A desire to represent what we might call the postmodern aspects of things, right? The meaninglessness of the horror, right? Who don't share Heller's sense that underneath it all, there's something that can be done about it. So it's a compromise. It is not, in any sense, the hypnotic cure, right? After Catch-22, Heller is not better. And as an audience, after reading the book, we are not better. It's in a way, it's a way to manage, right? It's permanent therapy, if you will, and it's a way to work through. So that's where I will leave you, and sort of turn it over to questions.